Good morning, Heritage Church. My name is Suzanne. I have the gift of being one of the pastors here. I guess none of y'all are soccer fans. Is that correct? Y'all know the World Cup is on this morning, and a lot of people are watching that. And so it's good to see all of you that came out on this rainy morning. It's wonderful to see you. When you came in, you were handed an announcement sheet. It tells you all the things happen in the life of Heritage Church. You can open up and read that as well. It has a Connect card on it. If you'd be so kind, just kind of rip that off for me and put your information on that as much as you feel comfortable with. You'll drop it in the offering bucket at the end of our service. It has a place for prayer requests. Our prayer list is maintained online. It goes out each and every Thursday in our online newsletter, and we are faithful to pray over those needs. If you're a guest here this morning, we welcome you. We know that you have many choices and places to worship, and it's an honor to have you here. We have a small gift from us to you. Make sure you stop by and grab one of these from us on your way out the door. So here we are in Summer Blockbusters, week 3. So far, we've talked about Jurassic Park. We've talked about Ocean's 8. And today, you know, the movie that we're going to be discussing together is Won't You Be My Neighbor? Now, a lot of people might be like, why are you talking about movies at church and what does this have to do? We believe that God is everywhere, that Jesus is everywhere. And one of the biggest problems we have is we're not looking for him. You see, the divine touches everything. Jesus even put it this way. He said, give them eyes to see and ears to hear. Are we looking for that? Are we looking for God in the world around us? And so what we do is we watch the summer's hottest movies every Sunday night. After we finish this one, Michael and I will go see a movie tonight for next week. And we watch the film thinking about where is the divine in that film. And so we find the spiritual theme and then we write a message to go along with that. And so this morning we are doing Won't You Be My Neighbor? Raise your hand if you know who Mr. Rogers is. Okay, yeah, they say that most anybody over the age of 25 should know who he is. People a little younger than that might not unless their parents let them watch him. But if you don't know who Mr. Rogers is, Mr. Rogers, I'm laughing at the young people going, I don't know. But Mr. Rogers was on television. He had a program for children for over 30 years. For 30 years it ran on television. And what a lot of people don't know about Mr. Rogers is Mr. Rogers just wasn't someone who did a TV show. Mr. Rogers was a Presbyterian pastor. And he felt called and he made it his ministry to change children's life for the better his entire life. He's kind of a folk hero, Mr. Rogers. I mean, a lot of people, y'all know the song, It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Come on, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Let's go to the end. Let's make the most of this beautiful day since we're together. Come on, Caitlin, we might as well say, you don't know it, do you? Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Good job, everybody. The rest of you are going, these people have lost their minds. You know, when I saw the movie at the theater, it's a documentary. And a lot of people, you know, aren't into documentaries. And y'all know I always say I'm a docu-nerd. There's never been a documentary made that I don't like, that I can't learn something from. So I love documentaries. But this one has really just struck a chord this summer. Out of all the summer movies that are out right now, it's number 10. That's a big deal for a documentary to be number 10. A lot of people are watching it. And I got to tell you that when you're in the theater, there's a lot of, you hear sniffles and you hear, you know, and I mean, people are leaving, you know, I got something, I got popcorn in my eye, you know, that kind of thing. It's a very moving film. It's filled with compassion. It's filled with goodness. It's filled with love. And it feels so good just to sit in there and hear that because of the world in which we live. We live in a world where it feels like there's a lot of hate and there's a lot of dread. There's so much dread in our world. There's so much fear in our world. And Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor? This film just really touches the heart. Mr. Rogers had one goal. And his one goal was to teach children how to be a neighbor, how to be a good neighbor. And wouldn't you say that in the world in which we live, our world is in desperate need of some good neighbors? But see, Mr. Rogers, he didn't learn how to be a good neighbor by going to school. You know who he learned how to be a good neighbor from? From Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus was his teacher. Jesus was his Mr. Rogers, for lack of a better term. And Jesus told us that there were two things we're supposed to do. Now, I know that religion and faith can be so complicated. There's so many rules. Do this, don't do that. Try this, don't do that. You feel ashamed. You feel like you can't measure up. But there's only two things Jesus wanted us to do, and here they are. Someone asked Jesus, what are the two things? What's the greatest commandment? Which one are we supposed to follow? Jesus simply said this: love God. Got it? Love God. Number 2, love your neighbor as yourself. You know what Mr. Rogers excelled at? A lot of us get that we're supposed to love our neighbor. We're supposed to care about other people. But Mr. Rogers also taught children to care about themselves. And there are a lot of us who are walking around in the world. We kind of get to love our neighbor, but we're awfully mean to ourselves. And Mr. Rogers had the beautiful gift of bringing it together to show people that in order to be a good neighbor to the world around you, you've also got to learn to love yourself. And so Mr. Rogers, he had this sweater. And this sweater it's iconic. You can actually see it at the Smithsonian. I've seen it. Has anybody seen it at the Smithsonian? Only me. Wow. Oh, there's one back there. Yay. Yeah, I've seen it at the Smithsonian. They also have his sneakers there. And those sweaters aren't just sweaters. It looks like just a nerd sweater, right? Like none of us would wear that right now, right? Looks like maybe Tom King, right? But, it looks like a nerdy sweater to most of us. But for Mr. Rogers, that sweater was important. His mom knitted most of those. So his mom would make those for him. You know what Mr. Rogers said about things? He tells this wonderful story about how his mom would knit those with love for him. And he says, the best thing, listen to this, y'all, this is good. He says, the best thing about things is they remind you of people. Isn't that just so powerful, the things that Mr. Rogers would say? This Mr. Rogers thing is such a big deal right now. It was just his 90th birthday, and they had a lot of celebrations for his 90th birthday. And I'm going to tell y'all something that you probably don't know, but next year, there's not going to be a documentary about Mr. Rogers. Next year in 2019, there's going to be a motion picture. It's called You Are My Friend, and Tom Hanks will play the role of Mr. Rogers. So we know that that's going to be something to look forward as it comes to the theater. But these sweaters were important. But the sweaters were part of a bigger picture that he was trying to create for children. You see, children in the world, they often feel lost and they often feel alone. And Mr. Rogers wanted to create a place where children could feel loved and children could feel safe. And isn't it funny that, yes, children feel that, but even adults, we'd love to feel loved. We would love to feel safe. The original Mr. Rogers show came on in the afternoon. And later on it moved to public television and aired at all kinds of different times. But the original one came on in the afternoon. And what he did was, his thought was that he would be the guy that as the kids came home, when your dad came home from work, what's the first thing your dad would do when he came home from work when you were a kid? He'd go in his room and he would what? Change his clothes. And so Mr. Rogers, what he did, he goes in there, he takes his clothes off, he puts the sweater on, he puts the comfy sneakers on, he sits down, makes the kids feel comfortable. Mr. Rogers looks at the camera and he begins to have a conversation, much like a parent might like to have a conversation. And Mr. Rogers spent his entire life trying to show children that they are valued and that they are loved. But he wasn't the first teacher of this. Jesus taught this, as I said. And Jesus taught this so much that it spread. Jesus didn't just teach it. Jesus lived it, didn't he? And so there's this scripture that's written from the Apostle Paul. And he's writing, he has Jesus as his teacher. And, he learned from the other disciples and all the people that have been learning. The early church is rising. And there's a church. There's this church, y'all. Can you believe it? There's a church, and they're not being good neighbors. Anybody ever been around church not being good neighbors? In fact, this church is being bad neighbors. And so Paul writes to them about what kind of a neighbor they should be and what kind of neighbor Jesus would expect. And we're going to look at the scripture this morning, and then we're going to look and see how Jesus lived this scripture out. I'm excited to be talking about this concept of being a good neighbor because I believe our world is in desperate need of good neighbors. And here's what the scripture says. Therefore, as God's chosen people, that's us, holy and dearly loved, guess what? That's us too. Dearly loved. Never doubt for a second you are dearly loved. Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. You see, every day of Mr. Rogers' life, when he put on that sweater, it was way more than a sweater. When Mr. Rogers put on that sweater, he was showing love And our world is in desperate need of people who will be good neighbors. And it starts with compassion. And compassion is when we respond to others with concern and love instead of selfishness. Because selfishness is our default, isn't it? I mean, we want to make everything all about us, but you respond to others with love and compassion. And Jesus was one of the most compassionate people in the world. Think about in scriptures, every time he encountered someone, no matter what was happening for him, did Jesus make the space to be with them? To be with them and to be present with them? What a good neighbor Jesus was. But this compassion thing, my favorite scripture about the compassion of Jesus is a bunch of believers, they're all gathered together, and as they are gathered together, there's crowds upon crowds, and Jesus is thinking about them. He could be thinking about himself, because of me, I'd be thinking, God, I wish these people would go home, right? And gosh, would somebody get me, somebody come bring me something, I wouldn't be thinking about them, but Jesus was thinking about the people around him. Scripture says this: when he saw the crowds, he was moved with compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Don't you think that Jesus looks at us today and he's still moved with compassion? Because we're kind of harassed. A lot of times we often feel helpless. Jesus knows our heart. Sometimes we forget who we're even following. We forget that. But we have an opportunity every day to live out compassion in our world. And as followers of Christ, our number one, the most compassionate thing we do is when someone tells us something's going on with them, this is the first sentence come out of our mouth. What do we say? I'll pray for you. That's what we say, right? I mean, and we should, and that's good. But you know what? Jesus was moved with compassion. If you're moved, that's some action. So if someone's struggling, you could say, I'm going to pray for you. But what if you could say, I'll be with you? What if you could offer your presence? You could go and you could sit with someone. I remember upon the death of a family member that I had a friend, and every day, right after something, you lose somebody you love, you're preparing for the funeral and all those things, and you're in a state of shock and all that. But I have a friend who would ring my doorbell every day, and she would come and she would just sit on my couch. Just presence. Didn't have to talk about anything. She would just be there. But there's even more than presence. There's practical support. I call people often when they've got something going on. I say, can I help you with it? Can I scrub a toilet for you? And they always laugh, and no one's taken me up on it. Maybe one of you will be the first, but I'm serious. If you really needed help and you need someone, sometimes we need that, right? So we need prayers, we need presence, we need practical support, and that's how you show compassion to the world around you, because the world is in desperate need of people who will be good neighbors. But then it's also kindness. I think that kindness has been minimized in the world around us. We think we've been taught that kindness is an act. If you do something nice for somebody, if you pay for the guy behind you coffee, you're being kind. I don't think kindness should be an act. I think kindness should be a lifestyle. And Jesus tells us how to be kind, and we might not like what Jesus tells us that being kind truly is. Jesus tells us this in the Gospel of Luke. He said, love your enemies. Those people you don't like, the people who when you're around you want to go, ooh, you're supposed to love them. That's kind. And do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons and daughters of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. You see, this is radical kindness, the kind of kindness that Christ has. And Mr. Rogers, he was an extremely, really super kind person. And you saw a little bit in the clip about the police officer, the black police officer. This time is going on, we're having civil rights. There's all these civil rights things happening. And there was a real story of a pool in Alabama. And or maybe it was Mississippi. I can't remember. Alabama or Mississippi, either one. And this pool, they were revolutionary, and they decided they were gonna open their pool. White people and black people could swim together, and it would be absolutely no problem. And some people became enraged, and so they went over to the pool and they took some nasty chemicals that humans shouldn't be in, and they dumped it all in the pool to prevent this from happening. And Mr. Rogers was furious. He was furious. Don't you love it when people say this? That ought not be. This isn't right. It's not the kingdom of God. That's what Mr. Rogers said. So you know what he did? He makes this statement. Like 2 days later, he airs this scene that we see, and it's a hot day, and the postman comes in. He says, "Man, Mr. Rogers, it's hot." And Mr. Rogers says, "Yeah, it's hot." He said, "You know what? We need to get the pool out, and we need to cool ourselves together." So they get the pool out. They fill it with water. Mr. Rogers puts his feet in. This postman puts his feet in. And in the documentary, the man who played the postman tells his story of being with Mr. Rogers. And he talks about what a difference Mr. Rogers made in his life. And he says this about Mr. Rogers. He said, "Mr. Rogers was the first man to tell me that he loved me." He said, "Mr. Rogers will never know what a help he was to my life." And so right now, what I would like for you to do is I would like for you just to close your eyes for a minute. And I want you to spend about 30 seconds thinking about your own life. And here's my question. Who has helped you? Okay, I'm going to ask some of you. So here I come. Get ready. All right? So who has helped you?
Tom King.
And how?
He brought me here.
Oh, that's nice. Who's helped you?
My mom
How?
done everything for me in my whole life.
Nice. Who's helped you?
Miss Minnie.
And how did she help you?
She was there with me when I had my daughter and I went through a divorce.
Nice. Very good. Who's helped you?
Jimmy Reed. He's my neighbor, and he's the world's best neighbor. He helps me with everything.
Nice. Like Mr. Rogers, right? Who's helped you, Terry?
I'd say my son, Trey.
And how?
Just strength and growth in Christ.
Good. Who's helped you, Amberly?
Teachers and parents.
And how?
Encouragement.
Okay, good. Tina, who's helped you?
A lot of people. I'm kind of old, so I have a lot of people to think of. Probably most of all my dad.
And how?
He's just constantly believed in me and unconditional love.
Good. Jason, who's helped you?
My wife.
And how?
Get us to go back to church.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's really good. None of y'all are safe, okay? Barb, who's helped you?
Oh, I still have a very good friend that's helped me through lots of rough times.
Good. Nina, who's helped you?
My husband.
And how?
He helped me believe in myself.
Oh. Mary, who's helped you?
Liam.
And how?
He shows me who I want to be.
Liam is her brother. Who's helped you?
My dad.
And how?
He is always willing to drop whatever he's doing to come to my aid.
Nice. Who's helped you?
My friend Wendy.
And how?
She loved me when I didn't think I was lovable.
Nice. Very good. Do you know who's helped you? Do you know?
Uncle.
You don't? Okay, you don't want to. Okay. Who's helped you?
Wife and family.
Okay. And how?
Kept my life in order.
Nice. Kim, who's helped you?
Tony has. Through
And
his
how?
love and support.
Nice. Very good. Joyce, who's helped you?
A lot of people.
Okay.
Between car accident, raising kids by myself, a lot of people.
A lot of people. Curtis, who's helped you?
So many people, but mostly my grandparents when I was growing up.
And how did they help you?
Well, they believed in me when I didn't have a clue.
Mm.
They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and they just supported me.
That's good. What about you, Spencer?
My mother, as far as introducing me to church and just bringing me when I was growing up, and continue that through time.
Nice. What about you, Natalie? Who helped you?
My sweet nieces help me all the time.
How do they help you?
With all of my children.
That's wonderful. Anna, who helped you?
This is going to seem like a canned answer. You and Michael have been just tremendous in getting us back to church and believing in church.
That's good. Who helped you?
Suzanne helped me.
Stop. Okay. Anybody want to that I didn't share that you're just dying to share? Dying to share who helped you? No, nobody's dying to share. Isn't it interesting, though? Isn't it interesting that we all have those people? And isn't it interesting that a lot of us could say we have a lot of helpers? And so often we spend our lives thinking no one's there for us. But the truth is, none of us sitting here, there have been people with us and for us all the way. And sometimes we miss that. And do you know what Mr. Rogers said about that? Mr. Rogers said that you should always look for the helpers. Look for the helpers, because the world is in desperate need of good neighbors. But it's also going to take, if you're going to be a good neighbor, it's going to take a little bit of humility. And humility is understanding that we're all in need of grace. I was having a conversation with a friend just the other day, and my friend and I were talking about, she said, people are just going to have to learn I'm who I am, and I mess up and all that, and don't we all? Like, I feel bad for somebody else sometimes having to deal with me, right? And I mean, you just are who you are, and you try to do better, but, we need to remember that everybody is a work in progress. And no one person is all bad or all good. We're all kind of a mixture of all these things. And we're all on our own journey, and God is working on us each and every day. But sometimes I think, with this humility thing, we think that it's bad to feel good about ourselves. Mr. Rogers never said it was bad to feel good about who and what you are. Mr. Rogers, in fact, encouraged you to remember, as Scripture says, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And God's still at work on you, but God has began a beautiful work inside of you. And so humility is just the understanding that we're all in need of God's grace. Jesus put it this way. He turns humility on, just turns it upside down. He says, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he just turns humility around and puts it, in a whole other vein. Mr. Rogers, who had every right to feel pretty darn good about himself, as he was headed toward his deathbed, Mr. Rogers died of cancer. And as he was dying with cancer, he was speaking to his wife. And there's this story in Scripture that tells us that one day there will be a judgment day. We don't like to talk about that very much, do we? And Jesus is Jesus is going to judge us on how we lived our lives, on what kind of neighbor we were, how much we loved God, only on two things, how much we love God and how much we love neighbor as ourselves. We're going to be judged, and when we are, Jesus is going to separate into the sheep who will be with Jesus and the goats who won't. And so Mr. Rogers is on his deathbed. He's close to death, and he says this to his wife. He says, do you think I'm a sheep or am I a goat? And his wife said to him, Mr. Rogers, or she called him Fred. She said, Fred, yeah. She said, Fred. That's kind of funny, right? She said, I hope so after all the years they were married. She says, Fred, if ever there was a sheep, you are a sheep. He was such a humble man. Mr. Rogers believed that all of us could learn a lot when it comes to humility. And he tells us, he says that, no one arrives alone, no one does it all alone, and that we should always remember that we should be humble people because the world is in desperate need of good neighbors. But then that Scripture tells us that we should be filled with goodness. That, we should be filled with goodness. Goodness to me is the God in you. When we're good, it's the God in us coming out. In fact, Scripture says, this is Jesus talking, and he said to him, why do you ask me about what's good? Because what is good, right? There is only one. There is only one who is good. And he's talking about God being good. So God is very, very good to us. And Mr. Rogers, he realized that he wanted to pour into kids, but he also realized this. He realized that the world in which we live is an evil world. There are bad things that happen in the world around us. There are bad things that happen in our lives. Each and every day, all of us have things that happen. And so Mr. Rogers would talk to children about things like assassinations when someone died. He would talk to them about the divorce, which they had to. He would talk to them about grief, about losing a friend. He would talk to them about medical issues and what was happening in their world. And he would try to talk to them about goodness. And you know what Mr. Rogers, his biggest fear was? This is fascinating for us in the world in which we live, and it's something for us, if you're a parent or a grandparent or you have a child in your life, it's something it's a child you care about in your life. He said this, he said, the screen is what we become. Let me say it again, the screen, he's talking about TV, is what we become. I think we have to be really, really careful to understand that are we modeling Jesus to the children in our lives? Because how we act and how we live is what they will become. And the world is in desperate need of good neighbors. Desperate need. You know, Mr. Rogers was so compassionate and passionate about people being good to one another. And he said that, you know, in our faith, a lot of times we feel like we don't measure up. I talk to people all the time, and they say, you know, I'm not where I should be in my faith. I'm not taking God seriously. I'm not living for God. I'm not doing the right thing. And Mr. Rogers has this wonderful sentence about living these traits out to be a good neighbor when he says this, and he simply says this. He says, the most spiritual thing you can do is to be a good neighbor. Wow, just think it's really only those two things, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, because our world is in desperate need of good neighbors. And then, if you're going to be a good neighbor, you got to have patience. Patience, wow, we do really, really great at patience. So anybody in here struggle with patience? For goodness sakes, don't pray for it, because then things get tougher, right? And so, patience is how you act when you're waiting. And, Mr. Rogers, he knew a little bit about patience, but Jesus knew us. And he knew that we were going to struggle in this world where things aren't always perfect and things aren't always like a television show. And Jesus says this to us when he says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. And so Jesus says, I offer you rest in the middle of things. And Mr. Rogers, he had to learn about patience. Do you know that, he's probably 28 years into his career, maybe 20. And the millennials come along. Anybody millennial in here? Y'all poor millennial people. They say such bad stuff about y'all, don't they? Are y'all mad? Yeah, y'all should get like t-shirts. Y'all should unite, right? And they say all these bad things. And so a news channel came on and did a report about millennials. And you know who they blame for millennials, not working very hard, and millennials thinking they're all that in a bag of chips? That's what they were saying in the article. You know who they blamed? It was Mr. Rogers' fault. It was his fault because he kept telling them they were all special. You know what Mr. Rogers' response to that? His response was right back. He said this. He said, no one can grow until they're accepted for who they are. He believed that much. He was so patient. And so we're called to love God, and we're called to love our neighbor. And we can be patient with things, but oftentimes we're not patient with people. And love that neighbor, when love thy neighbor, when Jesus said that to us, he didn't mean to love people who look just like you, just the people in your neighborhood. I mean, we live in a world where most of us don't even know our neighbors if we were honest. I mean, we've got snarky things to say about what time they turn on their water or how their dogs bark. Most of us don't know our neighbors. We pull into the driveway, we take our car, we pull it in, we pull the little lid, we go in our house, and we don't spend a lot of time with our neighbors. We don't know who our neighbors. We live in a world like that. And Mr. Rogers didn't believe that we should live in a world like that. He believed that we should love our neighbor. So that means you have to love people, are you ready for this, who aren't like you. You have to love the atheist. You have to love the addicted. You have to love the afflicted. You have to love the immigrant. You have to love the gay. You have to love the black, the white, the Hispanic. You have to love the Jewish people, Muslim people, whatever religion they are, people. You have to love poor. You have to love rich. If you're going to be a good neighbor as Jesus wanted you to do, guess what? You love everybody. And then finally, if we're going to be a good neighbor, we got to love. I think love is the greatest force on the world. It is the change, the number one thing that changes us is love. The power of love, and as Mr. Rogers said, or the lack of love, is what causes us to change. And Jesus, when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? What do I need to do to really follow you? I want to show you these words straight out of Jesus' mouth when he said this. This was his answer. You're to love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. You're to love God with everything you've got. That's the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like this. Love your neighbor as yourself. You see, I think the question, won't you be my neighbor? I think it's an invitation. It's an invitation to us to put on compassion. It's an invitation every day to put on kindness. It's an invitation every day to put on humility, to put on goodness, to put on patience, and most of all, to put on love. Because we have a world all around us, people you meet every day who are silently screaming to you, "Won't you be my neighbor?"